Chapter 22. The aggravation of the general crisis of capitalism after the Second World War. The Second World War and the second stage of the general crisis of capitalism, World War I, inevitably led to World War II. Lenin predicted that the imperialist contradictions exposed by World War I would lead to further conflict. The post-war redistribution of power proved unstable, with the US rising, Germany recovering, and Japan expanding aggressively, setting the stage for another war. WWII's nature and scale. World War II, initiated by fascist states, was a war of conquest for the Axis powers and a liberation struggle for the Allies. It was far larger in scale and destruction than World War I, with immense human and economic costs. State monopoly capitalism thrived. The war fueled the growth of state monopoly capitalism, with governments supporting large corporations through contracts and policies, leading to increased profits for monopolies and intensified exploitation of the working class. Imperialist aims frustrated. The imperialists hoped to destroy the Soviet Union and suppress revolutionary movements. However, the Soviet Union emerged stronger, and the war fueled national liberation movements in Europe and Asia. Rise of socialism. World War II led to the expansion of socialism. People's democracies were established in Eastern Europe and Asia, including China, significantly shifting the global balance of power away from capitalism. Deepening crisis of capitalism. The war ushered in the second stage of capitalism's general crisis, characterized by the system's further weakening due to the loss of vast territories and populations to socialism. The formation of two camps in the international arena and the breakup of the single world market, emergence of two opposing camps. World War II resulted in the formation of two distinct global camps: the socialist and democratic camp led by the Soviet Union and China, and the capitalist camp led by the USA. This division reflected not only political ideologies but also economic and social systems. Split of the world market. A key consequence of this division was the breakup of the single world market into two parallel markets, one socialist and one capitalist. This further exacerbated the general crisis of capitalism by limiting access to resources and markets for capitalist countries. Contrasting economic approaches. The two camps embodied different economic development models. The socialist camp focused on rapid growth of productive forces, peaceful economic activity, and improving living standards. The capitalist camp, constrained by its internal contradictions, relied on militarization and expansion, leading to a decline in living standards for workers. Conflicting international policies. The two camps also represented opposing trends in international politics. The US-led capitalist camp pursued aggressive policies, including war preparations and suppression of internal dissent. The socialist camp championed peace, international cooperation, and strengthening democracy. The crisis of the colonial system of imperialism becomes more acute. Colonial crisis intensifies. The second stage of capitalism's general crisis is marked by a severe crisis in the colonial system. Imperialist powers attempted to offload the burdens of war onto their colonies, leading to a decline in living standards and fueling resentment. U.S. imperialism expands. The U.S. aggressively expanded its influence in former European colonies under the guise of aid, further exploiting these regions and increasing tensions with other imperialist powers. Rise of anti-colonial movements. The growth of the proletariat in many colonies, coupled with the weakening of European powers after World War II, fueled strong national liberation movements. These movements fought for independence and an end to colonial exploitation. Breakdown of the colonial system. Key events like the victory of the Chinese Revolution and independence movements in India, Indonesia, and other countries signaled a breakdown of the colonial system. Imperialism's grip on its colonies weakened significantly. Shrinking sphere of exploitation. The shrinking colonial sphere intensified economic and political difficulties for capitalist countries. The loss of colonial resources and markets further destabilized the imperialist system. New features of anti-colonial struggle. The national liberation movements took on new characteristics, with increased leadership from the proletariat and communist parties. In some cases, this led to prolonged armed struggles against colonial powers. Resistance across the globe. Anti-imperialist resistance grew across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, with people fighting against economic domination and political oppression. The failure of U.S. interventions in Korea and Indochina demonstrated the growing strength and determination of these movements. The intensification of the unevenness of development of capitalism. The expansion of American imperialism. World War II exacerbated uneven development. World War II further intensified the uneven development among capitalist countries. While Germany, Japan, and Italy were defeated and Britain and France were weakened, the U.S. emerged significantly stronger. U.S. economic expansion. The U.S., unscathed by war on its own territory, experienced a massive expansion of its economy during World War II. This was driven by increased production to meet wartime demands and the capture of markets previously held by European powers. American domination and its limits. U.S. monopolies sought to establish global dominance after the war, expanding economically and politically. However, their ambitions were thwarted by the recovery of European economies and growing competition from other capitalist countries. Marshall Plan and its consequences. The U.S. implemented the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe, but also to create dependency and draw these countries into its sphere of influence. This strategy ultimately led to the formation of NATO and increased militarization. Trade wars and dollar gap. The U.S. aggressively pushed its exports while restricting imports, leading to a dollar gap in other countries and straining trade relations. This protectionist policy disrupted traditional economic ties and intensified competition. Growing contradictions. The U.S.'s expansionist policies fueled contradictions within the capitalist camp, particularly between the U.S. and Great Britain. These contradictions manifested in struggles for markets, resources, and spheres of influence. Contradictions lead to conflict. Despite forming alliances like NATO, the underlying contradictions among capitalist countries persisted, driven by the pursuit of profit and competition for resources. This validated Lenin's theory that uneven development in the imperialist era inevitably leads to conflict. The blame for war. While the U.S. and its allies blamed the existence of socialism for the inevitability of war, history demonstrates that wars are rooted in the contradictions of capitalism itself. Both world wars originated from conflicts within the capitalist system. The militarization of the economy of the capitalist countries. Changes in the capitalist cycle. Militarization as economic strategy. With limited access to resources and markets, capitalist monopolies increasingly rely on militarization to stimulate production and maintain high profits. This leads to a growing share of national budgets dedicated to military spending. Consequences of militarization. Increased military spending leads to budget deficits, growing public debt, and inflation, further exacerbating the inherent contradictions of the capitalist economy. Soaring profits amidst decay. Despite the underlying economic problems, monopolies continue to rake in massive profits, highlighting the parasitic nature of capitalism. Inflation and declining purchasing power. Rampant militarization and inflation severely erode the purchasing power of currencies, making it harder for ordinary people to afford basic necessities. Parasitism and uneven technological progress. While capitalism doesn't necessarily halt technological progress, it becomes increasingly uneven and focused on military applications, neglecting broader societal needs. Economic essence of militarization. Militarization diverts resources towards unproductive military consumption, while suppressing wages, exploiting the peasantry, and increasing the tax burden. This reduces consumer demand and contributes to the conditions for economic crisis. Changes in the capitalist cycle. The breakup of the world market and militarization distort the traditional capitalist cycle, making it more uneven and unpredictable. Post-war crises. The text cites examples of economic crises in the U.S. and Western Europe after World War II, demonstrating the persistent instability of the capitalist system despite temporary stimuli from military spending. Uneven development and crisis. The uneven development of capitalist economies, intensified by war and militarization, creates further instability and contributes to the accumulation of factors leading to a global economic crisis. Intensified impoverishment of the working class in the capitalist countries. Impoverishment of the proletariat. The post-World War II era saw a further decline in the living standards of the working class in capitalist countries. Monopolies, driven by profit maximization, intensified exploitation and passed the costs of war and militarization onto workers. Wage suppression and inflation. Monopolies, often with the support of reactionary trade union leaders, suppressed real wages by preventing them from keeping pace with inflation. This, coupled with rising taxes and rents, significantly reduced workers' purchasing power. Deteriorating conditions. The text highlights the decline in real wages, rising cost of living, and increased unemployment, particularly among the working class and intelligentsia. It cites specific examples of how purchasing power and living standards have fallen compared to pre-war levels. Growing inequality. The data presented shows a stark contrast between the soaring profits of monopolies and the worsening economic conditions of the majority of the population. This highlights the growing inequality inherent in the capitalist system. Rising discontent and resistance. The deteriorating material conditions fueled social unrest and discontent among the masses. This manifested in a surge in strike movements, the strengthening of progressive trade unions, and the growing influence of communist parties. Working class solidarity. Communist parties and progressive trade unions played a crucial role in uniting the working class against capitalist oppression, countering the divisive tactics of right-wing socialists and reactionary trade union leaders. Intensified oppression by the monopolies in the agriculture of the capitalist countries, and impoverishment of the peasantry monopoly domination of agriculture. The post-World War II period saw increased control of agriculture by monopolies and finance capital. This manifested through various mechanisms like mortgage banks, credit institutions, and control over pricing and processing of agricultural goods. Exploitation of farmers. Monopolies exploited farmers by paying low prices for their produce while charging high prices to consumers. This squeezed farmers' incomes, leading to indebtedness and ruin for many. Growth of large farms. The text provides data showing the increasing concentration of agricultural land in the hands of large farms and latifundia, while small farms struggle to survive. This trend is evident in the US, France, Germany, and Italy. Rising costs and debt. Farmers faced rising costs, including ground rent and property taxes. This, coupled with declining incomes, forced many into debt with banks and credit institutions. Decline in demand and overproduction. The impoverishment of the working class and increased military spending reduced the demand for agricultural goods. This led to overproduction, falling prices, and the destruction of food supplies even as people faced hunger. Agrarian crisis. The combination of factors described above, monopoly control, exploitation, declining demand, and overproduction, created the conditions for a renewed agrarian crisis in the capitalist world. Heightened contradictions. The post-World War II period witnessed a further intensification of capitalism's internal contradictions, particularly the conflict between the advanced productive forces and the outdated capitalist relations of production. This signaled the historical decline of the capitalist system. Crisis of bourgeois democracy. The crisis of capitalism also manifested as a crisis of bourgeois democracy. The ruling class increasingly resorted to anti-democratic and repressive measures to maintain its power, highlighting the inherently exploitative nature of the system. Proletarian internationalism as a solution. The text emphasizes the importance of proletarian internationalism as a unifying force for the working class and oppressed people worldwide. It calls for solidarity and cooperation in the struggle against imperialism, war, and capitalist exploitation. The inevitable downfall of capitalism. The author argues that the continuation of capitalism's general crisis, coupled with the growing strength of the socialist camp, makes the eventual downfall of capitalism inevitable. Any future war initiated by imperialists would hasten this process by further exposing the system's internal contradictions. Growing resistance to imperialism. The text highlights the growing resistance to imperialism and war, led by the working class and communist parties. This resistance manifests in various forms, including strikes, protests, and the strengthening of progressive movements. The power of the peace camp. The socialist camp, led by the Soviet Union and China, represents a powerful force for peace and international cooperation. Their efforts to ease global tensions and promote peaceful coexistence have achieved significant successes, as seen in the end of the Korean War, the restoration of peace in Indochina, and the Austrian State Treaty.